Okay, so we are live, set, and ready to go. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, friends. So we are starting on the first block, the first section of this retreat, Suttas, Framework for Study and Practice. And so just as a reminder, this retreat is meant to be kind of like a quick outline, right? It's not exhaustive in terms of going into all the details. Right? We are kind of doing a survey of various things in a way to, the purpose of this retreat is not to kind of learn all kinds of scholarly things. The purpose of this retreat is to understand why the suttas are important, how you would use the suttas, and make it easier for you to use the suttas. That's the real purpose of this retreat. And that's why I'm kind of how I've decided to focus on certain things so that we have an overview and an understanding as we go along. So the first thing I think we should do is to understand what we call the Pali Canon. So Pali, obviously, because that's the language it's recorded in. What's a canon? C-A-N-O-N, as opposed to C-A-N-N-O-N, the artillery thing. So a canon, if you look up the dictionary, it says an ecclesiastical rule or law enacted by a council or other competent authority. So what we see here is this is actually exactly, the word canon is exactly perfectly used here, because the Buddhist tradition records multiple councils. Councils of the first council, which we'll talk a little bit about, was made up of 500 awakened monastics who came together to codify the teachings. And this was still hundreds of years before it was written down. We'll talk about these kind of things as well. But over the councils, the various councils, what came together was called the Pali Canon. And this Pali Canon is usually called the Tipitaka. T for three, Pitaka for baskets. So there's three parts, three major divisions of the Pali Canon. The first is the Sutta Pitaka. This is where the majority of this retreat is going to be, the Sutta Pitaka. The second is the Vinaya Pitaka. This is where all the rules for bhikkhus and bhikkhunis are. So all the monastic rules are in the Vinaya Pitaka. And the third basket is the Abhidharma Pitaka. Abhidharma is something that developed over time. In the first council, this was not codified because it mostly didn't exist. There were parts of it kind of coming together and things like that, but it didn't exist in full as an actual thing until later. And so what the Abhidharma Pitaka is, and I want to give it some justice, I want to read the summary of it from some of the sutta websites. So Abhidharma Pitaka is a collection of texts in which the underlying doctrinal principles presented in the Sutta Pitaka are reworked and reorganized into a systematic framework that can be applied to an investigation into the nature of mind and matter. And that definition perfectly encapsulates what the Abhidharma is. If you are quite analytically, intellectually inclined, Abhidharma is something that actually might be very beneficial to you. If you're more practical and pragmatic, probably better to stick to the suttas. At least that was my experience. I have, in the early days, I did obviously attempt to understand and read the Abhidharma, but it wasn't my cup of tea. This is why I said yesterday, if you want to learn about the Abhidharma, I'm one of the worst people to learn it from. I'm pretty good at if you want to learn about the suttas, but Abhidharma, Abhidharma is not my thing. So it's important to understand that this this canon, there is like what modern scholarship says about things, and then there is what the religion, what the people who practice Buddhism say about things, right? And the tradition says about things. So the tradition holds that the Pali Canon is what we call Buddha Vachanam, means the word of the Buddha. Now, depending on who you ask, this is not necessarily meant to be literal, because obviously if you read some suttas, they're not all by the Buddha. Some are Sariputta, some Moggallana, some even Chitta the householder, right? There's a variety of different disciples of the Buddha who are featured giving teachings in the suttas. So, but the tradition holds that these are, especially the suttas, are the direct word of the Buddha. If you talk to like a Sri Lankan person, this is what they'll say. So this is very important to understand this, the kind of difference between modern scholarship and the Buddhist tradition. But the Pali Canon is basically, in the Theravada school, is everything that has been written down, codified, and taught for the last 2,500 years. And I'll give you a wonderful graph that's going to make your head spin, but it's at least good to know that some people have made graphs. Let me share the screen. Here it is. And if those of you who are new to this, you just look and you just see a bunch of lines and words, and it's just this huge blur. Right? But for somebody who is understanding it a bit better and trying to figure out how it all falls into place, something like this is invaluable. So I don't know, can you see my mouse cursor? You can. All right. So we have on the either side, there's the Vinaya Pitaka, and the other side is the Abhidharma Pitaka. The Abhidharma has 7 books, and one of the ways that modern scholarship knows that the Abhidharma is a later thing, because the Vinaya Pitaka and the Sutta Pitaka has a lot of the same stuff that you'll see in the older texts of the Mahayana, but each of the traditions has Abhidharma Pitakas that can be quite different. So that's one of the ways that they tell. And I'll talk about this towards the end of this talk when I talk about EBTs. But so each of the 7 books that you find in Theravada can be quite different than the 7 books you find in the Mahayana, this kind of thing. So, but we are here now for this retreat, we're going to talk about the Sutta Pitaka. And the Sutta Pitaka has these 5 breakdowns, and we'll go over all of these things. And then the 5th book, so these 4 here are considered early texts. In the 5th book, only part of it is considered early text. So again, to avoid confusion, I'm not going to talk more about all this stuff in detail right now. Again, we're doing a survey. Like things like this, if you want to, you can Google and find things like this, or usually at the end of the retreat, I send an email with all the resources. So I can send an email and you can get all these things for future reference. But the most important thing to understand is that the Pali Canon is everything. Everything in Theravada that's written down throughout the and taught and developed throughout the last 2,500 years, that's the Pali Canon. So then, what is Pali? And oh boy, this is an interesting one. This actually highlights one thing I wanted to mention. When it comes to a lot of the history, when it comes to a lot of the who believes what, a lot of this stuff is not fully agreed upon by scholarship. And so Ethan has a question, are commentaries included in the Sutta Pitaka? So commentaries are not considered to be part of the canon. They're considered to be what they call para-canonical. So it means like they're parallel to the canon. So these are things that are have been, developed and written down over the centuries and the millennia by various teachers who have given commentary on them. They're technically not considered part of the canon. Okay, so what is Pali? So Pali is something like what Pali is, how it developed, where it comes from, very debated. I've seen at least 3 or 4 different kind of perspectives on this. Again, traditionally, Pali is considered to be how the language that the Buddha spoke, or at least one of the languages that the Buddha spoke. It's kind of expected and understood that the Buddha probably spoke at least multiple languages. And when we find out tomorrow about the culture and the era of the Buddha with the 16 realms, you can understand how that would be probably possible and practical. But I'll read the Pali Text Society, which is one of the oldest and most respected and revered Western traditions, Western organizations, responsible for the first translations into English and things like that from like the late 1800s. I'll give their definition of what Pali is. Pali is the name given to the language of the text of the Theravada Buddhism. Although the commentarial tradition of the Theravadins states that the language of the canon is Magadhi, the language spoken by Gautama Buddha. The term Pali originally referred to a canonical text or a passage rather than to a language. So this is an interesting thing, right? So Pali is talking about people saw that, okay, this is a Pali. And the Pali, this canonical text, was in this language. So then they attributed the language. They said, okay, now this is the Pali language, right? That's what this is saying. Rather than to the language, and its current use is based on a misunderstanding which occurred several centuries ago. The language of the Theravadan canon is a version or a dialect of Middle Indo-Aryan. We'll talk very briefly about the Indus Valley culture tomorrow. But this is where we get the term Aryan from. The Aryans, the Indus Valley culture, were people from the north. So they're not technically considered to be part of the Indian continent. So not Magadhi, created by the homogenization of dialects in which the teachings of the Buddha were orally recorded and transmitted. This became necessary as Buddhism was transmitted far beyond the area of its origin and as Buddha's monastic order codified its teachings. So what this is saying here is, as Buddhism started to grow, and it started to be connected to and contacted into so many different languages, there was a desire to kind of codify it into one language that could be transported, and that the teachings could be, because remember, we're talking about oral tradition still, and so that the teachings could be kept in one vessel that could be kept more accurate, right? If it starts getting diffuse, then the teachings start to become diffuse. So they wanted to keep the teachings in a more secure vessel that could be more monitored, right? And that could be kept accurate. A lot of people think that oral tradition is highly inaccurate. Again, we'll talk about that tomorrow. This is not the case. So Pali, this is the language that has come down, that all of the Pali canon is in, right? And of course, it's translated into Thai and Burmese and Sinhala and English, but it all comes from the Pali. As a matter of fact, many things are not translated yet, like the commentaries. Most of the commentaries you couldn't just read unless you knew Pali. If you know Pali, then it's very easy. You can read the commentaries. But most of them are not translated. So this is where you get the difference between, say, you've heard the word sutta or sutra. You've heard the word kamma or karma, nibbana or nirvana, right? So this is, when you hear this, we understand it. It's the same exact word. The only difference is the language. Nibbana is Pali, nirvana is Sanskrit. And so Pali and Sanskrit are the two main ancient languages that the teachings have been put into. Pali in the Theravada, Sanskrit in the Mahayana. And so Pali, when you hear the word Pali, when you think about the Pali language, you think of it in the context of the ancient teachings that have come down into the Pali canon. You could also think of it as similar to, if you're Western and you're kind of familiar with the Catholic ethos, you can think of it as how for most of the history of the Catholic Church, the Bible was only translated into Latin, right? So only priests knew what was in the Bible until like the 1500s, the 1600s, then that started to change. Well, this is similar. For most of the history, only the people who knew Pali could read the suttas, and only the people who, and so most people didn't know the suttas. But now this is why we're in such a wonderful time that the most people in existence are able to read the suttas today than ever before. This is very important. So what is a sutta? So sutta is translated, if you translate, what does sutta mean? Literally, it means thread, like a sewing thread, but it also means like a scripture, like a teaching. So a sutta is where you're going to find all the teachings of the Buddha. Right? This is where the suttas. This contains the collections of the teachings from the Buddha, the disciples, and where all the big Dhamma comes from. And so again, this is, like I said, this is something that is part of what we call the early Buddhist texts, or EBTs. And it's important to understand what an EBT is. The early Buddhist texts are the heritage of all Buddhists of all traditions. This is not a Theravada thing. This is not the Theravadins have the earliest text. This is not the case. Both the Theravadins and the Mahayanans, and even the Tibetans to a certain degree, have the early texts as part of their tradition. And basically equally, all three have developed later texts that are used primarily, and so the suttas kind of collect dust. This is pretty common. Let me see if I can find the thing here. In the traditional Buddhist education, the discourses have usually not been directly taught. Suttas have not been directly taught. Rather, the teachings and principles found in the discourses have been assimilated and organized in later texts, which became the medium of education. And the Theravada discourses were until recently passed down in Pali, and so were only accessible to those, usually monks, who learned Pali. And not all those who learned Pali would study the discourses. It seems that teaching was for practical purposes handed down in local monastic traditions based on handbooks and sets of notes and commentaries. Before modern times, it would have been rare to find any but the largest monasteries that actually possessed a full set of the suttas. Today, printed sets of the canon are widely available in both Pali and translation, but they are still often left in locked cabinet on a shrine, unread. Think about that. I remember I spoke to a young Sri Lankan gentleman years ago at Bhavana. And he said, Bhante, he says, I never got to read the suttas until I read them in English. And that blew my mind. I was like, well, wait a second. Why? And then I found out later that in Sri Lanka, they're considered holy so that they don't want to translate the suttas into the language of the common person, only in the high language. Very similar to how in Christianity, Latin was the proper language for the Bible, right? So very similar things. So this is where I was saying, it's like learning the suttas is actually like a revival. This is not a common thing. This is a revival thing. And some people will say, oh, this is a Western Protestant thing, and they'll be negative about it. But how do you explain people like Bhante Ji? Right? There are people from Buddhist countries that realize the importance of the suttas. And you have people like Bhante Ji who made it their life mission that's what they taught. They taught the suttas. Right? And so, people like Bhante Ji, I have so much gratitude for that they were able to do this. So to finish out in the last couple minutes, the early texts are considered to be pre-sectarian, from a time before there was Mahayana and Theravada. They're called the Nikayas in the Pali. They're called the Agamas in the Sanskrit. And scholars like Bhante Analio, Bhante Sujato, to a lesser extent Bhikkhu Bodhi, Bhante Ji, that have learned they've learned Sanskrit, they've learned Chinese, they've learned even Tibetan. Like Bhante Analio is a powerhouse in this. And they can say, okay, here's the Satipatthana Sutta in the Pali. Here's the Satipatthana Sutta in the Sanskrit or the Chinese. Let me see what's the same. And they found that for the most part, throughout thousands of pages, they're about 95% the same. What this suggests is that these teachings have been preserved orally so well that even though hundreds of years and thousands of miles apart, they were written down in different languages, they're almost exactly the same. That's the amazing thing about the early texts. It's mind-boggling when you think about it. Even me as an anthropology major who knows that oral tradition is actually pretty accurate. To think about that is still mind-boggling. It's still amazing that these teachings were preserved in such high fidelity that in different languages, thousands of miles apart, they're almost exactly the same. It's a miracle, really, is what it is. And so when you understand that, you understand, oh, what these teachings are the heritage. They're the heritage of all of us. Every Buddhist person, they're there. And even some people in the Mahayana, they understand this. Like the Mahayana place where I became a Buddhist, where I had my first retreat, right? It was Chinese Chan, but they also studied the Agamas, and they also had Pali teachers, right? They had my first retreat, which was mostly Mahayana, and I learned about the Lotus Sutra and Bodhisattvas and such, but there was Bhante Dhammajiva, the abbot of one of the most well-known famous monasteries, forest monasteries in Sri Lanka. He was there, right? And he taught Satipatthana, and he taught from the Suttas. So like that was an amazing thing for me to see, right? That even though the traditions, both the Theravada and the Mahayana, basically keep these old texts and collecting dust in a cabinet, there's that connection between the two, right? And both the Mahayana and the Theravada can study the suttas and can see that where the origin of their later teachings comes from. It's very important. So this is the importance of the early texts. Very important to understand this. And so I'm going a little bit over, but I'm mostly on time, even though we started a couple of minutes late. I'm kind of proud of myself. All right. But I want to, we're going to do some meditation now, but I want to show you where this meditation that I'm going to give you, there might be some flourishings of my own or of teachers like Bhante Ji, like there's some flourishings in different perspectives and ways of doing it. But when you do a guided meditation with me and you hear me say something, the sutta, you say, oh, that's where Bhante is getting this from. That's very important. Yeah, James, I sent it in the email. Everybody who through Eventbrite, if you have the link for the to get on the Zoom, you should also have the schedule. So it's in the same email. So these questions, I please save your questions for the Q&A later, because we don't really necessarily have time. Write them down, remember them, and we'll talk about them during the Q&A. Okay, so yeah, I wanted to go to the suttas. Okay. All right, here's Sutta Central. This is one of the multiple websites that I will be showing and going over. I'm actually going to, on the last talk, the last section, we're going to go over, like in detail, how to maneuver these kind of websites, right? So you understand. But for now, let's go to the Anapanasati Sutta, Mindfulness of Breathing. So here's the three baskets, Sutta, Vinaya, Abhidharma. So it's going to be in the Sutta Pitaka. All right, come on. There we go. It's going to be in the middle discourses, and I'll go over this more in the next talk, these different sections here. It's going to be, now see here, see the Agama? This is the Chinese translation. This is the middle length discourses in the Pali. This is it in the Chinese. So you can actually see, you can actually go. This is the amazing thing about this website is you can actually pull it up for yourself and read it. But we're going to go to the Nikayas. And what did I say? 118, right? So we have to go to, this is number 1 to 118, boom, boom, and sixfold. See, in all this, you're going like, oh, what's going on? But when you know, you know. So here it is, mindfulness of breathing. And we can go with Bhante Sujata's translation or Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, which is rare. I'm going to talk about translation stuff later, tomorrow probably. But let's go to this. And so we have the beginning section, which I'm going to skip. Well, I'll talk about the beginning sections of suttas more tomorrow. And here we go, mindfulness of breathing. So mindfulness of breathing, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and great benefit, etc. And then how? So we'll see here that the Buddha is telling you how to do it. And it might be confusing, and you might need to hear from a bunch of different monastics kind of explain their perspective on it for you to start to understand. Again, we'll talk about that more. But how to do it is right here. You can read it. How is mindfulness, and bhikkhus, how is mindfulness of breathing developed and cultivated? Here, bhikkhu goes to the forest or to an empty hut. So going to a secluded place if possible, folding your legs crosswise, keeping the body erect, and establishing mindfulness in front of you, right? So there you go. This is how you setting up things. Mindful, he breathes in, mindful breathes out. Breathing in long, they understand I breathe in long. Breathing out long, breathe out long. Breathe in short, short. And those of you who've done guided meditations with me, you've probably heard that, right? Long and deep, short and shallow. I'm doing it exactly from the teaching, right? This is important. This is why people like myself, people like Bhante G, right? You'll always know that if I'm giving you something, it's directly from the suttas. If not, I will tell you. Right, so you know. And so it's very important. And then I breathe in, experiencing the whole body of breath. That's a controversial topic. I'm probably not going to explain that, but it's a good example. Breathe out. Breathe in, experiencing tranquilizing the body. Breathe out, experiencing tranquilizing the body, right? And so you can understand this. Again, you might need some translation of the English to understand what is being said. But you listen to a bunch of monastics talk about it, then you can understand, oh, okay, at least enough to put it into practice. So you can see this directly from the suttas. All right, we're going to do 3 more, right, during this retreat. And I'm going to show you, here it is in the suttas, and then we're going to do it. And so it's very important to understand that. Even when I talk about laying down the burdens in the beginning, when I talk about, the mighty Atlas, etc., that's also from the suttas. Obviously, Atlas is not from the suttas, but laying down the burden is from the Burden Sutta. So it's very important to understand that. But in the interest of time, well, let me see. Sometimes when I search it, it doesn't. Does it come up? Ah, there it is. Right? When I talk about laying down the burden, this is what I'm talking about. Having laid the heavy burden down without taking up another burden, one is having drawn craving out from its root, one is free. Right? So this is an important thing to understand. Right? Now, the suttas are there. They understand you. They show you what to do. You might need help understanding what the suttas are telling you what to do, and that's okay. But the suttas tell you what to do, right? This is so wonderful that the Buddha gives us all these instructions, all these toolboxes. So let's start our meditation. So set yourself up in a posture that works for you. When we think about posture for meditation, now obviously, if you're sitting in a chair or a couch or something like that, you know, a lot of these the posture issues might not apply because it's a bit easier, especially for those of us who did not grow up sitting on floors. But for those who grew up sitting in nice comfy chairs, sitting cross-legged on a cushion can be hard. So it's important to reflect on understanding your posture. So because of that, we will do some scanning through the body for a couple of minutes. We do the scan through the body for two reasons. The first is to slowly start bringing our mind from the external, all this stuff going outside the mind and body, to the internal, focusing on this mind and body. And the other is to develop mindfulness of the body, to understand the body so well that you can see when the posture is unbalanced or when there's small feelings of discomfort that will, as you meditate for longer periods of time, grow to large feelings of discomfort. So this is an important meditative and practical practice. You can bring your awareness to your feet. By bring awareness, this means to focus your attention on whatever sensations or feeling arises in that part of the body. For instance, what is the feeling of the feet pressing against the floor or the cushion? If while you're going through the body, you're having trouble coming into contact with a feeling or sensation, then you can prompt yourself by asking, what do I see? What do I feel? And then oftentimes a sensation will arise in your field of awareness. Bring your awareness up through the ankles and into the thighs. Up through to the knees. the thighs, to the pelvis and hips. Pelvis and hips are a very important part of your posture, very important part of the body to pay attention to. The position of the pelvis impacts the position of the legs and the spine. If the upper body is leaning and slouching, most of the time the problem is probably in the position of the pelvis. Pay close attention to this part of your body. When you're ready, bring up your awareness up through the abdomen and the chest, observing the position of the spine. Ideally, the spine should be in a neutral position. If the discs of the spine are compressed, the spine leaning and slouching here and there, that will be the most likely cause for back pain as you sit for longer periods. Bring your awareness to the shoulders. Check to see that they're hanging loosely, not scrunched up and tight. Down through to the elbows and hands. Observe how the position of the elbows and hands also impacts the position of your spine, can cause bending and leaning. Think about your body like a house or a pyramid. The foundation needs to be firm and balanced. The lower body. And once that foundation is firm and balanced, then the house, the middle part of the pyramid, can rest comfortably on top of the foundation. And then moving your awareness up to the head. If the spine is neutral, Everything resting comfortably on top of the bottom. Then the head also shouldn't be slouching and leaning. Chin parallel to the floor. And if you're somewhat new to sitting on a cushion, even if you do have good posture, eventually your muscles will tire. And you'll start to bend and lean and slouch. That's okay. The more you sit without propping up your back, the stronger it will get. Exempting people with injuries and severe back issues. For the average rest of us, that is the case. And when you're done setting up your body in a comfortable and stable position, take 3 deep breaths. Let go of the body. And after your breaths, let go of the breath. From here on in, try not to manipulate or control the breath in any way. This body has been breathing from the moment you were born and will continue to do so until the second you die. It doesn't need you to do its job. Your job is to simply observe, investigate, and abide with the breath. Watch as this body breathes in. Watch as this body breathes out. Bring all your focus, attention, mindfulness to the breath. You may find most prominently the feeling of the air going in and out of the nostrils. If so, you can place your awareness there. If the breath is too subtle and hard to follow, you may find more prominent the rise and fall of the chest. You can place your awareness there. Or you can simply abide with the basic knowledge that this body is breathing in and breathing out. Friends, we come to this retreat, to our meditation, with many responsibilities, worries, and burdens. Family and friends, work and school, worries about the society, the future, the past. Many things that will seek to come to our mind as we practice. For the time of this meditation, for the time of this retreat, we practice letting go, laying down our burdens. Just like the mighty Atlas from Greek mythology who holds up the heavens, the earth, the world, so too do we each hold our world on our shoulders. A heavy burden. For the time of this meditation, for the time of this retreat, lay your world down and follow the breath. As you're following your breath, you will become distracted. Your mind will get bored with the breath and will run away to the past or the future, across the world or the galaxy. Or an external distraction like a sound will arise, the mind will attach to that and run after it. When this happens, if you're new, it's important to reflect upon that this is normal. You did not fail as a meditator or do anything wrong. This is the mind showing you how it works, showing you its craving. Whenever you get distracted away, you lose your mindfulness. Very slowly, it will start to dawn on you that you've been taken away from the breath. Once that dawning starts to happen, fully acknowledge that you've been taken away from the breath and try to come back to full mindfulness. And then practice letting go of the distraction by neither getting agitated and trying to push it away, nor by getting excited and grasping onto it. Simply try to give it no attention, no energy. Try to let it go. And then return to the breath. No matter how many times you're taken away from the breath, acknowledge, let go, and return over and over and over again. The Buddha tells us in the Suttas that the breath can take us all the way to awakening. We just need to follow it, to learn from it, to investigate it. The breath is home. It's always there waiting for us whenever we wish to follow it to the path of the ending of our suffering. Acknowledge, let go, and return. Acknowledge, let go, and return. As you're following your breath and coming back over and over again, every once in a while, check in with the state of your mind. Is your mind becoming more tranquil, peaceful, or not? As the mind becomes more tranquil and peaceful, you may begin to notice more subtle characteristics of the breath. Sometimes the breath is long and deep, sometimes short and shallow. See if you can observe these more subtle characteristics, how the breath is changing, impermanent. Try to investigate the breath deeper. Acknowledge, let go, and return. As you keep following your breath, keep checking every once in a while. Observe if your mind is getting more calm, more tranquil. Observe if the body is also becoming more calm and tranquil. The deeper you follow the breath. You may even begin to notice even more subtle, deeper characteristics of the breath. See if you can follow the full cycle of the breath. The body breathes in, and the pause, and the lungs are full of air. What does that feel like? The body breathes out, and the pause, and the lungs are empty of air. See if you can follow the full cycle of the breath. Observe ever more minute and subtle aspects of the full cycle. As the breath continues to lead us towards awakening. Slowly open your eyes, gradually transition from the internal to the external. The room around you, Zoom, and Dhamma friends in it. So friends, we are almost to the end of our first section, our first block. And I wanted to, as usual, give some mindfulness of eating meditation instructions. So in Satipatthana, which one of the meditations this weekend we'll be doing Satipatthana practice. In Satipatthana, it's very important to practice being fully aware and mindful of everything that you do. One of those things is including eating. And so it's very important to understand that typically what happens is the average person, when they get into meditation, they see instructions and it says meditate half hour in the morning, half hour in the evening. And their morning meditation is, they wake up, and when they sit down to meditate, their minds start thinking about all the stuff that might happen or will happen during the day, and all the various maneuvers and possibilities of choices you might make, and all these kind of things in the mind. And so for the first 25, 26 minutes of that morning meditation, your mind's just like chatting away, yappy. And then finally it starts to quiet down. And then the bell rings. And then you get up and you're off to the races. And then similarly, at the end of the day, you come back after a busy day at work, whatever you're doing, and you sit down and your mind just wants to go over, like watching movie reels of everything that happened during the day. And this person did that to me, and I can't believe that happened. Or, oh, this was a good thing, and what am I going to do tomorrow? And all these things are in your mind. And then finally, the last couple minutes, mind gets quiet, and then ding, and it's over. What's missing is continuity. What's missing is satipatthana, mindfulness. When you get up from that morning sit, you have the attitude, the mindset that my practice doesn't end. It just continues. And you practice mindfulness, satipatthana, throughout the whole day. And then when you go to sit down in the evening, your mind very easily becomes quiet and peaceful, not chatting away. It's because you've maintained mindful awareness as much as possible throughout the day. No one short of an awakened being can be fully mindful and aware 24/7, 365. But the rest of us are training. We can practice this. And so mindfulness of eating is one of those avenues that we can practice. A simile came to me years ago, and it's a simile I've taught now at many, many retreats. Every retreat at Bhavana for at least the last 5 some odd years. The 3.5, 4 years I was there, I would give the mindfulness of eating instructions before lunch on the first day. And I had thought of a simile that a vision came to me. Did I mention I was an anthropology major yet? if you know that, then you understand where half my similes come from. The simile came to me of the simile of the ember. And so this is a story about our ancestors. And I don't mean like what country you or your ancestors came from. I mean like 30, 40, 50, 60, 70,000 years ago. Like when our ancestors were all hunter-gatherers. And so they would, have a camp, they'd wake up, and it would be time to follow the herd, right? So they'd start moving. And those of you who maybe have done camping, you've started fires, you actually realize that like starting fires is actually really hard outside of like pouring a bunch of gasoline and throwing a match. It's actually quite hard. And especially if you're using more ancient techniques, very hard. And so our ancestors, who were no dumber than us, they were just as smart as we were. They figured out this technique where that they could take a dying ember left over from the fire, right? In the morning, you can see the fire pit, there's just embers. They take this ember and they're able to put it into a little container with little grasses and moss and things like that. And they kept that ember alive as they were traversing throughout the day, following the herd or moving for the season, whatever they were doing. And then at the end of the day, when they'd make camp, instead of having to bust out the wood and start, putting the wood, rubbing the wood together to try to get a spark and all that, which could take hours, they took the ember out. They made what they call a bird's nest, just like it looks like a bird's nest. It's just like a bunch of like dried grass and twigs and stuff. You can actually see this. You look it up on YouTube. You can see exactly what I'm about to describe. So they put the ember in the bird's nest, and then they start going like this. They blow on it, and that creates a flame. And then all they have to do is just put that right in the fire pit, and they have a fire. So similarly, the ember in this simile is our mindfulness. I wrote a whole article about it. I put it in the chat. So if you haven't seen that article before, you can check it out. And so if you develop the mindset that no matter what you're doing, the practice doesn't stop, then everything you do is practice. So let's go to eating. I'll give you some suggestions, some tips on how to practice mindfulness of eating. First thing is, if you're making the food, right, then you watch your mind and your desires, and like, oh, I want this today, I don't want that today, what's good, right? Observe that kind of process. And then as the food's being cooked, maybe the smells start to arise and the aroma, observe like that, oh, this is really good. I can't wait to have that food, right? Observe that feeling. Or maybe somebody else is in charge of the meal and what's being made, you don't really like it. It's like, oh, I'm gonna have to eat this. Observe that feeling. And then once you're sat down to eat, don't automatically go to what we have been going to for a long time. Don't go to I need the phone. Like, this is what we normally do, right? We have the phone, we have the food, or just like this. Just like this. And so eating just becomes an assembly line. Our mind's focused on what we're looking on the phone. Now, of course, we can't fully blame the phone. I am from a time before phones. I remember phones, when there were no phones. And what I remember is instead of, phones, people would have the newspaper. Or when we were kids, we would look at the cereal box. So I'd have the cereal box and I'd be eating the cereal, right? And so that's the first thing. When you observe that, if you do that, cut that out. Put the phone away, right? Put it out. If you're sitting in a spot, put the phone in another room. And then pay attention. As you take your utensil or your hands or however you eat the food. You take the food in the utensil or the hands, and then you bring it up to the mouth. You put the food in, and then immediately after that, put the utensil down, and then put the hand down. You see the utensil, and then hand, and then you observe the hand, you could say stay. Right? And one of the things I notice is as soon as if I'm trying to be very mindful while I'm eating, the split second I lose mindfulness, hands up, the assembly line continues. Hands up, scooped, assembly line. We want to break that cycle. We don't want to be on autopilot. We want to be fully aware and mindful of what we're doing. So once the hand is down, the utensil is down, everything's locked in, pay attention to what's going on in the mouth. The taste of the food coming in, and then the chewing. You have teeth for cutting, teeth for grinding, mashing. Observe that process. Observe how the taste fades away. And you just can't wait for the next bite so you can get that taste again. Observe, watch. And then you can observe how Bhante Silananda, a monk dear to my heart, who was a monk at Bhavana Society for many years. And while I was there, I remember years ago at a retreat when I was a layperson, he said, observe how solidity turns into liquidity. Right? So observe how the food gets mashed. And you can also observe things you notice, like what I've noticed is the food gets funneled. Like the tongue acts as kind of like a director, like a musical director. The tongue is like moving things around and it's funneling the food. It goes down the throat. And then your mouth is empty. And then you just pick up the hand, pick up the utensil. The hand is the utensil, whatever. Then put the food in the mouth. Complete the process over again. Utensil down, hand down, observing the process of eating, what's going on in the mind while you're eating. And then do that again and again and again until the food's done. And then when you go to the bathroom afterwards, being mindful of being in the bathroom. Right? The Buddha even says this. Maybe I'll even show it to you if we have time. It says, when you're being mindful of eating, walking, sitting, lying down, going to and fro, stretching, going to the bathroom. Right? So don't take the phone in the bathroom either. Pay very close attention to what's going on in the bathroom. That's the end of the eating process too. Although we don't want to hear about that nor mix the two, obviously. But that is the process of why this body eats. Right? What this body does to process the food. That's another thing you can reflect on. So friends, why don't we just go over the schedule briefly. I'll share screen. And somebody also posted that in the chat. Thank you very much. Remember, this is also in multiple emails you should have gotten, because I sent an email and then it automatically sends an email at 2 hours and like now. So you should have multiple emails with the link. If you don't, I don't know why not. But so remember again, for those of you who've done this retreats before, it's different because I have the ordination later on today. So from here till 1, free period, break, lunchtime, chores, do whatever you need to do. Then 1 o'clock to 2:30 is meditation. And however you want to break that up between walking and sitting. But I would suggest at least trying to do at least half walking. Okay. I gave you the link at the beginning of this. If you scroll up the chat, you can see the link to my walking meditation instructions. So if you don't know how to do walking meditation, you can follow that and practice. So try to do at least, at least half walking, half sitting, or at least a good chunk walking. And if you're, sitting is painful and I just would rather walk the whole time, also the same thing. Do at least a half or a little bit more of sitting, right? Both are very important. And so then we'll have a half-hour break, and then we'll meet at 3 o'clock for the Dhamma talk. Right? That should be more than enough time for me to not be needed for any more activities at the monastery. So we'll do our second talk, second block at 3 o'clock. Okay, friends. So I will leave the Zoom going, and either way, if something happens with my computer and I get disconnected, then you can still log on. If you want to come on together and meditate, sitting or in the Zoom together, that's fine. Whatever you'd all like to do, but we will all together be back together at 3 o'clock with meditation from 1 to 2:30. Okay, friends, have a good afternoon. I'll see you at 3.